and good morning and welcome to this video. This video should give you a good sense of the appeasement interpretations and what they said. So I'm going to very quickly run through the different schools of historians. So as you may well know, the first thing to know is that what appeasement was. Appeasement was a policy towards Hitler predominantly, but also Mussolini during the 1930s, which allowed them to violate and sometimes violate international law or invade other countries in order to prevent an all-out war. So it allowed for behaviors that were belligerent or warlike in order to prevent a world war, which obviously then still happened. There are 5 different interpretations of this policy and its success or failure, and they are, broadly about whether it was a success or failure, but also if it was a failure, who was to blame for that failure? Because obviously, in the end, it clearly did fail. So, first things first, we have the well done Chamberlain popular majority view. This was a view supported obviously by Chamberlain himself, who came back famously from Munich in 1938 September with his piece of white paper declaring that he had peace in our time and that everyone should go home and have a good night's sleep. Joseph Kennedy, the US ambassador at the time, was supportive of this policy, as was in the cabinet Lord Halifax, the senior member of cabinet. This was supported also by 40,000 letters that the UK government received at the time of Munich to congratulate them, and can be seen in examples at the time of the Conservative Party celebrating their success at appeasement. It was seen, and this is the argument, the content of the argument, as a good thing because it had prevented an all-out war. Yes, certain principles had been broken, but for instance, the promise around Czechoslovakia that Chamberlain had already given was, and not allowing Sudetenland to be taken by the Germans, that promise was broken, but it had been done in order to prevent a greater war. And the promise at Munich that Germany and Britain would not go to war was hailed by Chamberlain at the time as peace in our time. What was the context of this interpretation? What motivated people to take this view? Well, first off, many British politicians and many British people were haunted by memories of World War I. They weren't keen to get into another war, and particularly into a war over an area called Czechoslovakia, which was a relatively new country after the end of World War I and the borders built by or drawn by the Treaty of Versailles, and certainly one that didn't feel that close to many Brits. It felt, therefore, logical to seek peace rather than war. The impact of this interpretation was a sense of short-lived euphoria. As we said, Chamberlain turns up and back to London, with crowds greeting him and cheering him. Britain did feel guilty on going back on their promise they'd made to Czechoslovakia in 1936, but at the same time, they thought that Chamberlain had managed to find peace in a difficult scenario. And opinion polls show at the time that Brits were not, naive about Hitler, but they certainly saw that the Munich Agreement had provided a chance of peace. This was obviously challenged by others, most notably the Cato Group, who come next. But at the time, the context and the impact of this, it was quite a widely held view. Now, obviously, in your note taker, you should have own evidence to support this, but lots of details could be used to support this, not least the promise of Britain and Germany not going to war that Hitler had given, and also the 20 million that had died in World War I, and that kind of memory. You could also mention, as we have already, the 40,000 letters that went in to the government in support. The next interpretation, known sometimes as the guilty men interpretation, was something that emerged in 1939 as it became clear, particularly after March 39, when Hitler invades the rest of Czechoslovakia, that this promise, this piece of paper, was worth very little. Cato was the origin of this interpretation, and Cato was used as a pseudonym by 3 journalists who published a short kind of book or a set of articles at the time in the British newspapers, criticizing and talking about the appeasement policy not only as foolhardy and wrong, but also the product of cowardice by the British ruling elite, and particularly by Chamberlain, who became one of the several guilty men alongside his predecessor, Stanley Baldwin. So what's the content of this? Well, appeasement was a foolish, cowardly, and immoral policy that strengthened Hitler, that encouraged Hitler, and it weakened Britain. They prevented maybe war in the short term, but in the long term, it actually encouraged a greater war. The content of the argument would say, and it did go back all the way to 1931, with the concessions and appeasement on Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931, Italy's invasion of Abyssinia in 1935, and the whole of Alpac that the British and the French put together as a way to sell out the Abyssinians. And obviously the Munich Agreement, which was the kind of figurehead of this, or the worst case of this appeasement. As the guilty men write very strongly in this article, I mean, it's like, you know, it's pages and pages of accusations at the leaders of Britain. How many further proofs were needed that these countries were willing to break these agreements? The article named 15 specific individuals, as we said, largely laying the blame at Chamberlain, but also Baldwin as well, who was prime minister before, during the Abyssinian crisis, and during Manchuria, although actually that was also the first Labour leader at the time. So what's the context of this interpretation? Well, the context of the interpretation was Britain was scared. They were really fearful now. France was about to be taken completely by the Nazis. They'd failed in their attempt to try and beat back the Nazis in Norway. And they were just about to be, well, they were actually withdrawing and escaping from Dunkirk after a failed attempt to meet the Nazis and block their conquering of Western Europe. The three journalists who wrote it worked for a newspaper proprietor called Lord Beaverbrook. Now, Beaverbrook himself was a member of the government after Churchill takes power, and Churchill and Beaverbrook were very close. So the motivation behind this would have been not just to give a view, but also to get rid of the appeasers in government, notably to get rid of Chamberlain. There was a massive conflict in government, and this interpretation had a motivation, which was to not just get rid of Chamberlain, but also get rid of Halifax, who was seen as the obvious successor to Chamberlain, and put Churchill in his place, with Beaverbrook in cabinet as well. This interpretation had a massive impact. It was used at the time to, like we say, get Churchill as prime minister, and many people read it across the country. But also even afterwards, the Labour Party used it as a stick to beat the Conservatives with. Ironically, Churchill running in that election, saying the Conservatives were the party of appeasement. And it made appeasement a swear word, a dirty word to accuse politicians of. In fact, Truman in 1948, in a slightly different period of the Cold War, which we'll look at in another video, said that appeasement leads only to further aggression and ultimately to war. And that was the kind of viewpoint that Cato had put across. I think some have criticised this interpretation as being black and white and a little bit simplistic. And Churchill certainly didn't want to accuse, in the orthodox interpretation we'll see next, Chamberlain of being a bad person with bad intentions. He was simply miscalculating. And obviously, therefore, Churchill had the right calculations. Evidence to support this, I mean, you certainly, the most obvious example of this was Chamberlain, after signing the Munich Agreement, then only a few months later, finding out that not just the Sudetenland, but the whole of Czechoslovakia had been invaded. So Hitler's promise of simply just taking the Sudetenland was clearly false, and that piece of paper was not worth peace at all. It was not worth anything at all. The next interpretation comes, and it's called the orthodox interpretation, from Winston Churchill, in his book in 1948, The Gathering Storm. Now, Churchill wants to make this point clearly. He does obviously want to make the point that appeasement was a bad policy. It was encouraging of Hitler. It did not work, and it was a misjudgment. But he does not want to accuse Chamberlain, who was actually, it's fair to say, a close friend of his and politically at different points. He does not want to accuse Chamberlain of immorality or cowardice. He simply just thinks he was wrong. And by implication, therefore, Churchill, had been right. Churchill, who had been criticising the policy of appeasement back down into the 30s. Chamberlain had, according to Churchill, actually had the highest degree of moral courage, trying to walk this fine line between appeasement to try and avoid war, but he just got it wrong. Now, again, facts to support this, you could use the same facts as the Cato interpretation, but what's more important is well, it's not more important, you're going to need some of that, but the context is really, really crucial. Now, Churchill, it is worth saying, writes his own history here. Churchill, as it says here, Churchill himself said, "History shall be kind to me because I shall write the history," which was a kind of joke he was making, but it was truth to it. He was bitter about losing the 1945 election, and he felt that part of that was because of Chamberlain and the policy of appeasement, and he wanted to kind of preserve his political reputation. So that's part of the context. Churchill has his own motivations to promote himself, but alongside that is the context of the Cold War and the early Cold War, in which Churchill was making the argument, as he does in his Iron Curtain speech of 1946, that dictators like Stalin needed to be met with force, not met with appeasement. He did not, as he says in his book, want to repeat the past. This orthodox view becomes the orthodox view. It's a Churchill view that becomes the orthodox view, which means widely held, because TV documentaries are made out of it, which are very popular. Churchill's prestige adds a kind of element to it, and it becomes the kind of dominant view in Britain, and it probably arguably still is. It influenced politicians, as we've seen, like Truman, who saw appeasement as a dirty word, JFK when talking and thinking in relation to the Cold War, and even Tony Blair during the Iraq War used the orthodox interpretation as a justification for invasion in Iraq by saying that Chamberlain was a good man, but he made a bad decision. By implication, saying that not going to war in Iraq would be appeasing Saddam Hussein. Now, very few challenged this viewpoint. Historians do come in and challenge it, particularly the revisionist school. But one interesting critique of it has been given by John Charmley, who wrote that the central flaw of this is basically there's no sources in this book. This is just self-promotion. He talks about his experience, Churchill. He doesn't really give anything more than his own viewpoint. It's not really a historical work. That historical thinking comes with the revisionist view, the academic revisionist view, sometimes known as the rehabilitating Chamberlain view. Key thinkers here are people like A.J.P. Taylor, Donald Cameron Watt, and Paul Kennedy. And they like to say that Chamberlain was in an impossible position. They don't think that Chamberlain had many options on the table. He didn't, unless he wanted to go to all-out war straight away, have many other options other than appeasement. And in fact, war straight away would not have gone down well with the British public. So A.J.P. Taylor himself says that Hitler didn't even have a clear plan. Hitler was not structural in what he was planning in taking over Europe. And so it was very difficult for Chamberlain to be blamed. In fact, it would be unfair to blame Chamberlain for not knowing what Hitler's plans were, because Hitler himself didn't know. And that only emerged as the 30s developed. Donald Cameron Watt says that Chamberlain actually had a limited situation, limited resources. He had a public that didn't necessarily want a war. And Cameron Watt in particular is very critical of the Cato viewpoint, because he doesn't think that those involved in appeasement were stupid, weak, and ill-informed. In fact, they were very well informed. They were very, very, intelligent, but they just made the wrong decision, potentially. But, in the long run, maybe. But in the time in which they were in, they made some pretty smart moves. And Paul Kennedy also believes that appeasement was a natural policy for a small island state gradually losing its place in the world. And what that means is basically Kennedy thinks that Britain, and people particularly that criticize appeasement, had a view of Britain that was outdated. Britain was no longer the only world power that could determine what happened in Europe. In fact, Britain's dominance in Europe had already declined. And so the idea that they could have just declared a war and won it straight away is far too simplistic. What's the context of this interpretation? Why does it emerge? Why do people disagree with that orthodox view? Well, a few things to bear in mind. First off, in the 1960s, a lot of historians were starting to re-question or revise established viewpoints. Why? Well, there were lots of new people coming into universities who were asking the same questions or different questions of the same periods. And this is what revision meant. The Vietnam War showed what a military intervention could look like, what a kind of first strike, where America had sent hundreds of thousands of troops into Vietnam, and it had gone terribly. The intervention there, therefore, clearly showed that appeasement, or at the very least inaction, was sometimes better than action. And finally, there was an access to new sources. So after 1958, the British government had passed a Public Records Act, which meant that you didn't have to wait 50 years, but only 30 years for some of these official records. Not all the official records, some were kept still top secret, but many were available. And historians could now begin to study the 1930s and the decisions that leaders had to make during that period. It gave a new viewpoint in the 60s and 70s to those decisions, and new sources for historians to work with, which led to some of them to revise. The impact of this interpretation was not as wide as hoped. It stayed very much in the university, and the orthodox view remained the dominant view in the public perspective. But even within the university, we see some people pushing back at this. And this is what we refer to as the final interpretation, the academic counter-revisionist, a counter to that revisionist view. This was basically put together by a guy called Robert Parker. Robert Parker writes a book in the 1990s which wants to really have a go at the revisionists and say, you've gone way too far. Chamberlain, okay, yeah, wasn't evil, wasn't the devil, certainly wasn't guilty in the way that the Cato group would argue, but he still made a really bad decision. And he still, with appeasement, really took Britain down a road that only encouraged Hitler. And why? So the major real interpretation, contribution to this interpretation from Parker, is to say that Chamberlain himself was the problem. He had personality problems and assumptions that he made which were really harmful for Britain. Why? Because he thought he was too smart. He thought he was smarter than Hitler. He thought he could outsmart Hitler. He thought that he could play the kind of game that Britain were playing in the 19th century with Europe. But they were no longer that dominant. Okay? He overrated his abilities. He thought that he could reason with Hitler. And therefore, he was partly responsible for appeasement and its consequences. He doesn't, and this viewpoint does not agree that he was stuck in a position like the revisionists would argue. He had choices to make, and he betrayed certain alliances he built. So, for instance, with Czechoslovakia in 1938, despite having made a promise in 1936 to protect them from Hitler. He didn't need to make that promise, but by doing so, he then betrays them. And these are miscalculations from Chamberlain based upon his own perspective, his own attitudes, his own problems, his own personality. He ignored advice of his officials and never really listened to the advice he was given. Now, why does this interpretation build up? Well, first off, because I think people like Robert Parker are annoyed at the counter-revisionists, at the revisionists who come up with this view that rehabilitates Chamberlain. But secondly, because there's context here. There's a new set of sources that emerge, particularly from the Soviet Union. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990, these archives become open, and the archives that the Germans kept in East Germany, that the Soviets had taken away to Moscow, now become available for the historians to look at. People like Robert Parker can pore over these new sources. And what they show them is that Chamberlain was far too confident in what he believed Hitler was agreeing to. So when we see the British sources, we see that Chamberlain believes that he's got Hitler to agree to this or that. But from the German sources, we see that actually Hitler is really playing Chamberlain. That Hitler is not is willing to offer or say things that he knows he will not be able to do or not want to do, and that Hitler believes that Chamberlain is actually being able to be played. And so when, for instance, Hitler gets Chamberlain at Munich and has that agreement over Sudetenland, Hitler full well knows that he may well take the rest of Czechoslovakia, and he full well knows that that signing of no war between Britain and Germany may well be broken. He sees it as a short-term need, whereas Chamberlain sees it as a long-term alliance, or at the very least a long-term agreement that a war would not occur. And I think this is really where the context comes from with Robert Parker. So where do we end up in the interpretations? Well, we've had 5 of them. We've had 1, well done, Chamberlain. 2, guilty men interpretation. 3, the orthodox view. 4, rehabilitating Chamberlain. And 5, the Chamberlain back on trial interpretation. Really worth remembering which one is which, and worth remembering which would agree with which. To simplify, number 1 says that Chamberlain did a fantastic job and we've got peace in our time. Number 2 says that Chamberlain was one of the guilty men who sold out countries, and through his own foolishness, cowardice, he ended up ruining Britain's chance of peace. 3, the orthodox view, which says that it wasn't Chamberlain personally as being guilty, but he just made the wrong decision. He wasn't smart enough. 4, which says that Chamberlain actually was in a tough situation. He made the best decisions he could. And 5, which says that actually no, Chamberlain himself was the problem. It was a poor decision, appeasement, a poor set of policies, and it was informed by his own overconfidence. I hope that video has helped.